Hi, and welcome to the Legally Insane News Hour, which is a recap of this week's legally charged news events from around the nation. We're coming to a close on the second week of June 2022, and this is definitely a big week for our premiere edition of the Legally Insane News Hour, as we've seen a seemingly unquantifiable number of absolutely crazy things happening around the country that certainly qualify as newsworthy mentions in the Legally Insane News. A 62-year-old woman in Austin, Texas, has been charged with her husband's murder after a scalp turned up in a roadside bag. The woman allegedly bragged to her grandson that she disposed of her 70-year-old husband's body by feeding him to pigs. In another story in Maryland, 3 killed and another injured in a shooting at a manufacturing facility. Another story includes a hero dog unfortunately dies after saving her owner from a mountain lion attack. I both loved and hated reading that story. And another story, a 53-year-old priest from a Mexican megachurch was convicted on Wednesday of nearly 24 felony counts of sex crimes against children, including rape, human trafficking, and child pornography. This is a huge name, by the way, in the Mexican Catholic community. It was absolutely horrific to even hear about. I hope he gets what's coming to him in prison. Dozens of media publications, including the Wall Street Journal, CNBC, and others, boasted headlines of monkeypox, quote, doubling as spread continues, end quote, all while failing to actually share in those headlines the total number, which was 45 cases nationwide. I'll be talking at length about that one coming right up. In a new decision that hits Washington this week, which has them considering legislation that would make it illegal to fire employees who test positive for marijuana. I know a band of folks in holdout states that are going to be pretty happy to hear about that one. The Department of Justice has apparently opened an investigation to Louisiana police on widespread corruption allegations. And in news you probably won't hear too much about this week or any time thereafter, a white 17-year-old student was beaten to death by 3 black males that were all older than him and not a part of the school he was in. This happened in an Akron, Ohio school that was founded by the LeBron James Foundation. Found that pretty interesting. And finally, community members from Uvalde, Texas have spearheaded a new gun control bill that's passed the House with flying colors. I'll be detailing one of these stories in this podcast, and to hear my take on the rest, head over to legallyinsanefilms.com and click Join the Fan Club, where you can choose between the Legally Insane News Podcast, the Small Town Justice Podcast, and the Legally Insane Films membership, which gives you access to my documentary films, extended cuts, and outtakes. Again, that's legallyinsanefilms.com. Okay, first up on the Legally Insane News Hour is the sweeping gun bill that's passed the House this week in the wake of a horrific mass shooting scene in Uvalde, Texas. Lots of legal opinions are bound to be stirred by that legislation in the weeks to come, as seems always to be the case in the wake of yet another disturbed individual killing innocent people, destroying families, shattering communities, and, of course, making law-abiding gun owners feel the heat. Of course, the Uvalde shooting is absolutely just tragic. No one on any side of the gun legislation debate ever really wants to see our American brothers and sisters in gut-wrenching pain over the loss of their children to senseless violence. Of course, right? That's everybody's stance on that. Nobody denies that. It's horrible no matter what way you look at it. There's nothing about this that's positive or good, save, of course, for the lessons that we should be taking away from it. Now, this opinion piece is going to come in 2 segments before I get into it, so just kind of intro it a little bit. I'm going to pace myself. The first, of course, is the agenda, I think, that most people are missing. The agenda, of course, I'm referencing is people, unfortunately, using this tragedy to, how do I say this, piggyback their own agenda. There you go. I said it. The second is from the perspective of governmental interference. So before I get too far into it, I just want to reiterate real quick that nothing is sadder. I mean, I use a lot of humor in this show, but nothing is sadder and more disparaging than witnessing children being slaughtered, right? I mean, that's pretty much as bad as it gets. Outside of like Holocaust level tragedy, that's next up on the list. The adults that were there at Uvalde that went with them too, equally tragic, and their loss is clearly being felt across the nation as people express through marches and candlelit vigils and things like that. Unfortunately, however, their loss is also being used to push the narrative that simply isn't true. As far as I can tell, NPR is the first mass media syndicate to claim that there have been 27 school shootings so far this year. Now, I'm kind of picking on them, and I'm saying that they were the earliest, the one that I could find, because that claim was immediately and widely echoed around the web by individuals, indie media, and, of course, major networks alike. It wouldn't be so problematic, on that note, if it were actually true. But before I get into those facts, I should say that it should not go unnoticed that this is a claim that wasn't just conflated, as I'll show in the evidence that's forthcoming. It was also used specifically to strike fear in the hearts of parents, who will then, of course, create the momentum in their communities for eventually Washington, for the change that the publication seems to want. That's the agenda that I'm talking about. If you needed a definition, there it is. This is basically slanted media at its most conniving. And I'm not saying that NPR or left-leaning media has bad things at heart. I mean, like, you could technically say that, taking people's guns away, that's a bad thing at heart. But what they're doing, the sinister part of it, is that they're piggybacking it off of tragedy. That I hate. Okay, and they're skewing the facts to do so. That's what I'm really getting into on this one. I know that there's a lot of debate going on about it, but if I was a parent of a Uvalde student who knew this, I'd be furious. I'd be furious that the tragic death of my child was being used to push any agenda, even one that seems to ooze with loving, caring bystandership in mind, right? But it's NPR. Why would they lie? And how could they get away with it if it's completely untrue? This is a question you might be asking. That's a perfectly good question to ask. First, let me say that I really like NPR. I'll probably lose some people on that one too, but I do like NPR. They have very innovative stories. They've been around forever. They're grassroots oriented, all things I love. In programmatic terms, I've seen them over the last few years reaching out to new age groups and cultures, and they're on air and, the reporting personalities. They report international news. They go local, right on top of each other. Try to get any of that stuff from any of the majors, right? That's something that, love them or hate them, they got most people beat. What I don't like is when they join the ranks of those majors in skewing the data to push their narrative. I don't like that from left, right. I don't like that from center. Thankfully, center doesn't do a whole lot of that. So maybe we got that going for us. But let's get this straight. National Public Radio and their various publications pulled their data from a publication called Education Week, which is a largely reliable source that tracks school shootings. Their particular definition is, quote, an incident in which a person other than the suspect suffers a bullet wound on school property, end quote. I'm just going to say that again. An incident in which a person other than the suspect suffers a bullet wound on school property. I wanted to say that twice because it kind of takes a second to digest, right? It's basically one person shooting another person who is then injured, and that incident takes place on school grounds. And I'm pretty sure, looking back on it, I'm pretty sure that they are limiting school property to define non-post-secondary institutions of education. So that's primary and secondary. As is obvious by this definition, it gives kind of a wide berth for scuffles in the parking lot, outside of school hours, gangland shootings that spill over onto school property. And probably most important of all of this is shootings that do not end in death. That's where we derail. Okay. In fact, NPR's cited report, which comes from edweek.org, basically lumps both deaths and injuries into one data set, which is certainly their prerogative, right? It's their data sets. They can do with them what they want. Can they be used positively? Absolutely. But the problem comes when major mass media outlets take those data sets and use them to conveniently misuse or sort of misappropriate that gap between the very disparate and very important data points within that data set. banking perhaps on the notion that if anyone ever calls them on it, they can simply say, well, we trusted that they did their research. I'm sorry that it didn't go right for right-wingers, but that it conveniently benefits the rest of the article we based on it. That's a problem, because as much as I love NPR, you're not really lying, but you're definitely skewing the data.
In Maryland, 3 people are now dead and 1 other injured after a man attacked his co-workers in a manufacturing facility. State troopers quickly responded, confronting the shooter as he drove away from the scene. After exchanging gunfire, officers eventually injured and captured him alive.
The newsreel that you're hearing right now, even today, as I sat and wrote this story, there was a mass shooting in Maryland that claimed the lives of 3 and injured another. If this was on school property, I found it interesting that this would also fall directly under the definition that NPR is misusing as their referenced article.
The authorities have actually said very little about what happened inside this concrete molding company facility. They said they got a call about an active shooter around 2:30 p.m. and that they found that 3 of the employees of the company were shot and killed and a 4th was injured. Law enforcement officials say that 3 Maryland state troopers were speeding toward the scene when they came upon the suspected gunman's vehicle, and that when they tried to stop it, he opened fire with a semi-automatic handgun. They say the troopers fired back, hitting the man, who was then captured and hospitalized. One of the state troopers, they say, suffered minor injuries.
And this would be one of their included items, right? If this took place there, this would be not just a school shooting, but a mass school shooting. And I'll get into that in just a second. But if, in fact, one looks further into Ed Week's data of the remaining 26 school shootings, basically in their article, NPR states that just this year alone, just the first 5-6 months of the year, there have been 27 school shootings. All right. But if one looks further into Ed Week's data, which is where NPR got their reference points, all of the remaining 26 school shootings under this definition lump together both deaths and injuries. Okay. And so I'm just looking at the data now. There were 83 injuries or deaths. And that's a quote, injuries or deaths. And the vast majority of those, 56, were injuries. All right. This means that 2/3 of NPR's referenced shootings did not result in deaths. The data goes further on to indicate that the vast majority of school shootings end in 0 or 1 deaths. Technically, the tragedy at Uvalde overlaps Ed Week's definition. That part is true. But the incident is more correctly defined as a mass school shooting. And of mass school shootings in the U.S., there have only been 13 since 1966. I feel like I should have a soundbite for crickets chirping there. 13 mass school shootings since 1966. This definition, by the way, comes from the scientists at Scientific American for their May 25th article in that publication of the same name. Robbie Sawabi put it nice and succinctly in his June 26 article when he said, obviously 13 incidents in the last 56 years is a very different statistic than 27 incidents in just the last few months. Nevertheless, that didn't stop the misrepresentation of those figures in NPR's latest poll. Now, I point that out specifically because that particular article that NPR released, it's been shared, it's bounced around the internet so much. It's been used with people kind of fussing and fighting with each other on social media, kind of bickering back and forth in the comment sections of various posts on, Facebook and Twitter. What probably drives the greatest chasm, however, between the reality of gun violence data and the liberal media's interest in using the horror of mass shootings to drive an intimate message of basically ridding America of its guns can be found in a Pew Research Institute article. Now, the article I'm pulling this research from comes from the Pew Research's February 3rd, 2022 article. And clearly there's an issue with gun violence in America. Nobody's denying that. I think according to the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, more Americans died of gun-related injuries in 2020 than any other year on record. Now, remembering that this figure doesn't specifically rule out how trends in gun deaths have changed over time, that number, which is 45,222 cataloged deaths, of that number, 54% of all of those gun-related deaths in this country, more than all of the other gun deaths combined, were suicides. that should bring into perspective, technically a suicide is violence, right? So when you listen to someone on the mass media talking about all these gun deaths and it's it's violent, blah blah blah, they're including suicides, right? I'm not trying to minimize the other half of that 45,000. That's a hell of a number, but skewing the data to push a narrative is never correct, no matter what side of the conversation it ends up on, and regardless what the numbers say, or which side of the political divide they most benefit. No sustainable solution has ever conclusively been tied to more government intervention, and that's really kind of where this first part of the story goes. In fact, it's just the opposite. Though NPR might have their own stock of resources that they might deploy to dance around such a rhetoric, and that is what leads me to the second part of this story. My primary opinion is the same now, really, as it always has been throughout my life. I mean, outside of a national or international war, there are no legalized problems that individual states can't fix themselves. And that's where I think we need to be focusing our efforts. History has shown that the minute that we invite government in to solve all of our problems for us, they pounce on the opportunity to themselves benefit. And they do, every time. In fact, I would challenge everyone listening to this to think of even one time in the last 50 years where the government has been requested to step in. They've done so. They've passed legislation that is on the federal level sweeping, meaning it applies to every single state. And A, they haven't benefited hugely. And B, it's a save all and fixes every problem related to that for every single state. It just doesn't happen, right? And let's break it down to why. Federalism, the belief that more government is basically better for the people, is arguably why we spend more of our annual GDP budget on the American military-industrial complex, which is currently $778 billion, up nearly 5% from this time last year, than the next 9 nations combined. Just want to say that one more time for the cheap seats. We in America spend more on our annual GDP for the military-industrial complex than the next 9 countries combined. My belief, frankly, is that this is lazy governance when we invite Uncle Sam into our living rooms, right? And I think that's why the 10th Amendment to the Constitution was specifically added. It was added to reserve all decisions not ruled upon by the government to be the providence of the states. In effect, this is the popular vote of the community majority. There are still problems with this, as we're seeing in the recent resurfacing of the kind of then as now controversial 1974 Supreme Court ruling over Roe versus Wade. But I still prefer this manifest direction, which is always to espouse popular sovereignty, the concept that government is really only given power through and by the people, over any move or act to bring more steel to any hammer that the government already uses as a hammer to pummel our states and communities with legislation designed for sort of a one-size-fits-all solution. It's just never going to work on the community level. However, when we bring it back to the Uvalde conversation, lots of folks have chimed in on this issue, including Matthew McConaughey, who recently spoke at the White House, I think it was Tuesday. He delivered a very passionate speech about those who lost their lives in the massacre, and he also called for what he called responsible gun ownership. I point this out because this is a point where he and I are in complete agreement. There's lots of articles that are out there right now, understandably very concerned, very worried law-abiding gun owners who are like, hey, all of these things are tragedies, but there's another solution that doesn't limit liberties, and we need to sit down and talk about it rather than just inviting the government in. Like, bans have not worked. Got into a debate recently with a friend of mine of 15 years on Facebook. He was just like, no, you just don't need this type of weapon. I was like, well, it's like me telling you just don't need this type of car. I mean, I don't have any right to tell you what kind of car to drive. You really shouldn't have any right to tell me what kind of gun I own. It's up to the responsible gun owners. It's the responsibility of the parents that teach the children, right? In any case, he and I agree on this point. And as a staunch supporter of the Constitution and all its amendments, and most especially those that protect us against our ever-encroaching government, I feel that I have a solution for this conundrum of lawless abuse of weaponry in our country. And yes, if you were paying attention there, I said the abuse of weaponry there. Our gun ownership was supposed to shield us from harm and, of course, keep our leaders in check. Not to shoot school children, churchgoers, shoppers at local grocery stores, travelers on a subway, concert goers in Las Vegas, right? I'm hoping that everyone's picking up my narrative there, paying attention as I announced that all cultures and backgrounds are both affected by and affect this issue of gun abuse in this country. It is not limited to one person, organization, creed, color, sex, background, nothing. It is an American problem, and we as American neighbors need to handle it ourselves. So what is my answer? I hate to say it's more guns, but in effect it kind of is. Or at least let me say it's more gun owners who are trained and stand guard in their communities. That is what we need. All right. You know, what does that look like? Obviously, that's going to scare some people to be like, wait a minute, I don't want armed patrol. Well, we kind of already do have armed patrol. Unfortunately, that armed patrol, known largely as the police departments of the U.S., have gotten caught finally abusing their power at the advent of body cams and other various technologies that have become readily available to American citizens recently. So who do you want armed, right? That's kind of what it comes down to. But in the minutiae of that, what does it look like? Well, every community has fathers, many of whom are vets, all of whom, love their kids, presumptively. I'm willing to bet that these fathers would stand and be counted as the first to take their children's safety, not to mention the safety of their neighbors' children, as a very personal honor. I don't have kids, but if I did, I would probably take this as an honor as well. I would volunteer as a father, a non-father, I guess, to my nephew's school in this way, right? I would consider that a personal honor, which brings up a question. Have we lost that in this country? Honor? I don't think so. I think it's taken a backseat to fear-mongering and kind of a drop in national trust, but I also don't think that either of those factors are too firmly stitched into our culture to be undone, right? I don't think we're too far gone to uproot fear-mongering. I think it's people fighting it right now. I don't think we're too far gone to fight back on censorship and freedom of the press. I think there's a lot of people doing that right now, and I think we're gonna catch a bell curve, and we're eventually gonna beat that beast down. But I think that honor and local pride have been overshadowed. But just because they're currently living in a shadow, it doesn't mean that they're not alive and well, and that their time in the sun will return. To continue that metaphor, when a new day rises, right? And for those of us who have been in the military, we know full well that when you offer someone responsibility, like doesn't matter what their position, right? Let's just say a bosun's mate in the Navy, a deck swab, right? You hand that individual a certain responsibility, they'll realize that you've offered them not just the responsibility, but also your trust. And innately, it happens 10 times out of 10, innately and automatically, they take that trust very seriously. For those who've never been in the military, it's a lot like kind of taking a troubled student and putting them in charge of a group, say. Counterintuitively, right, against most expectations, they become less troubled. They start to focus instead on their depression or whatever. They start to feel a sense of personal pride in their new role. They eventually become leaders. That's the whole point to what I'm saying here. Like, we need more leaders, but more than just leaders, we need people who are proud to stand their post and safeguard our schools and places of meditation and community centers and so on. We need people willing to take that step further and be trained, to maintain training, and also be willing to work with a team and to volunteer their time, kind of engage in their communities and prove themselves trustworthy to guard our most precious resource. And yes, also to carry guns in the service of protecting that most precious resource. Is this strange? You might be asking yourself, this is just why am I even listening to this? Is more guns? I thought that was the problem. Now, how can we fight a problem by inserting more of the same problem, you might be asking? And that's a very reasonable question to ask. Well, the old adage, fighting fire with fire, brings with it a literal ring in its terminology, and I'm hoping that you're picking up the gun puns that I'm sort of jabbing in there. But before I get into that, I should say that it's not a catch-all. Okay, my theory, it's not gonna. Let's just forecast our minds into the future that doesn't exist but could, that my plan is implemented and we see it in reality. It's still never going to solve all of our mass shooting scenarios. I am not claiming that it will, and even more should still be done in keeping guns out of the hands who would do us harm. I absolutely still stand behind that, regardless what my gun-loving friends say. Sweeping gun ownership shouldn't be sweeping, clearly, because we're seeing the results of sweeping gun ownership and sweeping, not necessarily ownership legally. I think the people on that side of things know what I'm saying there. In any case, have we really tried all that we can try? Right? I mean, everybody on the left seems to argue that we're in desperate times. Well, desperate times require desperate measures. So to unfortunately take that out of your ballpark and put it into play, besides all of those other things, I mean, where would you rather see your sons and brothers and fathers be carrying weapons and training to combat threats to Americans? Would you rather see those guys overseas, where they're likely to just die protecting Uncle Sam's oil reserves against people who don't even want us in their country in the first place? Or would you rather see them here, protecting living, breathing resources like their brothers and sisters, their children, their parents, their grandparents? So how does this work? Well, it goes like this. For schools alone, and again, I'm not talking about anything else other than I'm not talking about religious institutions. I'm not talking about community centers. In fact, I'm not even talking about colleges and universities. I'm strictly talking about primary and secondary schools. We need to enlist the volunteer assistance of all available and willing fathers of school children. You might think, well, why would we limit it to that? Well, just bear with me for a second. As a start, obviously this can expand somewhere else later, but we need them to attend active shooter response training. We need them to maintain regular training sessions, at least biannually. We need to obviously have them pass rigorous background and psychological checks immediately, and then continuing as time goes on to maintain, maybe a community certification of some kind, and to be equipped with the appropriate body armor and communication devices that will both keep them safe as well as in communication with school officials and local law enforcement. These fathers, and I'm just going to call them community members from here on out, they will have skin in the game. This is why it's important that they're fathers, right? They have skin in the game. We need to start here because they're the ones most likely to volunteer. I can't imagine that schools are going to have it in the budget, or smaller communities are going to just be able to dole out money to pay for fathers to take a day off work, right? But if communities love their neighbors, we'll find a way to make volunteerism work, right? So they'll have skin in the game because their children will be in attendance in the school. They'll also create a direct link between the schools and their attending families. And the benefits, of course, are not limited to safe children, or safer children, I should say. Ultimately, they create a link between the schools and their attending families, right? They strengthen community ties with the schools, other parents. They'll get to meet their kids' friends. They'll meet other parents throughout the community as they come and pick up their kids, et cetera, et cetera. But also, they'll also strengthen ties with local law enforcement as well. Now, I'm hoping this is sounding less and less crazy as I go on. But yes, it does sound crazy. If you were to ask me if that sounds crazy, yes, it does. But what else sounds crazy? Doing nothing? Asking our government, which clearly does not care about us, to reach in even further into our communities, when we have everything we need to solve our own problems right here by ourselves. That's what I think is crazy. I think it's crazy that we have guns walking into schools, but that's not going to stop, right? Our government hasn't been able to stop that. In fact, my money's on our government doesn't really care, because our government doesn't benefit in any way when they need to implement something. They're not monetarily benefiting. They don't get more tax dollars out of it. They don't actually produce anything. They just offer services. And this is not a service that pays them back. And I want you to think about something else. When was the last time our government passed any legislation that was actually good for the American people and not just for its own interests, right? Our government bails out its cronies on Wall Street while there are people starving in the streets. They have billions of dollars to throw around at countries to fight wars that are not our wars to fight, while college students are crippled under debt for a degree that isn't worth the paper it's printed on. The Senate, I mean, don't even get me started. The Senate habitually gives itself endless terms and endless raises and endless insurance coverage, while teachers, the people that are responsible for educating the future of our country, their salaries nationwide reflect the abysmal education in our nation's students are receiving. They have to work second jobs to pay their mortgage. I could keep going, on government collusion with social media censorship and mass media fear-mongering. Like, none of this is addressed with sweeping government legislation. The only thing they're interested in, turning a profit. Otherwise, they would have done something else by now. I mean, the point here is, and I'm sorry if I'm detracting a bit, but we need to realize that our government has turned its back on us and we need to rely on ourselves. And I think that's a solution everybody can get behind. I mean, that's what we need anyway. We need to put our phones down for, 1 day a week and help our kids out. This is how the states were originally formed, not that we put our phones down back in the 1700s, but with our own sense of freedoms and our own agency to do what we need to fix our own individual problems. The founding fathers knew that catch-all legislation was not a sensible, sustainable rejoinder for every community problem in a free economy. They knew that, and it's still true today. What works to eliminate violent crimes in New York will not work in Louisville, Kentucky, and what works in Kentucky will not work in Oklahoma City. So instead of draping yet another cape around Uncle Sam's bony shoulders, America's communities need to be given the resources to deal with their own problems in ways that best service those communities, right? And I think that if we're going to entrust local safety to local fathers, local community members who love their families and their communities, we'll have more eyes. This is the other tangible result here, and the benefits from this abound, right? We'll have more eyes to watch more problem areas. We'll take a lot of strain off local law enforcement who, frankly, they're already caught in a very strange and demanding time in our nation's history. And even if they weren't, it still takes them forever to get to an active shooter call. I mean, by the time they get there, most of these active shooter scenarios, they've already claimed a dozen lives. The other thing we'll get is we'll finally get back to having an open door policy type of mentality in our neighborhoods, in our schools, and in our communities. And if you think all of this is a radical idea, I'd say I agree with you. But what would you rather see happen? A community member who's been professionally trained as a response-ready sentry in your school, or would you rather pretend that guns don't exist, try to get rid of all the guns you can, ultimately knowing that the only people who will keep them are still going to be doing these things anyway, and that the government's catch-all plan to penalize responsible gun owners right alongside the criminals who would get guns no matter what the cost? I'm pretty sure that between the two, there's one sustainable answer that seems pretty obvious, because no matter what you say and what you want to see in this situation that we're in this country, you will see guns in school. The only choice, the only responsible, reasonable, rational choice that makes sense is to make sure that we, the community members, are the ones carrying those guns, right? We should also ensure further that we're better trained, better armed, always at the ready to deal with a threat that's clearly not going to go away when our government is not obligating itself to protect us. They'll send opioids into our communities and rake in billions. They'll send unmarked rental vans with unidentified, heavily armed, uniformed DHS officers to remove bystanders from riots, instead of simply seeking community-based solutions. They'll do all kinds of horrible things to protect their billionaire cronies, but they will not protect us. It is up to us, my friends, to protect ourselves. That is the only way that we can truly actually consider ourselves protected. Is my plan flawless? Absolutely not. Will there be problems if it's ever implemented? Absolutely yes. But this is something that America's communities can do literally tomorrow that will affect change, real change that promotes real results while strengthening our communities. That's it for this edition of Legally Insane News. Make sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Kyle O'Donnell for updates and extras on this and other stories. If you're listening to this podcast at legallyinsanefilms.com or the Small Town Justice page, be sure to also download the Spreaker app, where you can directly subscribe and help me bump up my download totals. If you like this episode of Legally Insane News, consider becoming a supporting member. For just $3, you can get access to members-only unreleased articles and podcasts, case files on our latest investigations, updates for events and conventions that we're attending, and discounts on swag. To do that, just head over to patreon.com/legallyinsanefilms. There are 3 different memberships, each with more content than the one before. This is where I release all of my documentary films with outtakes and extras, as well as another podcast called Small Town Justice. You can check those out by going to legallyinsanefilms.com and clicking Join the Fan Club. Send any questions, comments, feedback, and show ideas to thejusticepod@gmail.com. This has been a production of Legally Insane Films, LLC. I'm your host, Kyle O'Donnell. We'll see you next time.